Hello, I'm Charlie Strader with the Bonita Springs Historical Society, and I'm here today with Diane Krant DeBost. Diane, thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
My name is Diane Krant DeBost. My father and mother, Mildred and Harold Krant, founded the shell factory in Bonita Springs in 1938.
Diane, I understand your family originally came from Canada. How did your parents wind up in Bonita Springs, Florida?
Mother and Dad got married in Niagara Falls, Canada. Dad was born in Nova Scotia, and Mother was born in Ontario. How they met, I have no idea, but they did get married, and Dad was the oldest of 10 children. And when they moved to Bonita Springs, most of his brothers and sisters and his mother and father all moved from Canada down here. And most of them ended up working at the factory in some position or other, and then finally most of them went off and started businesses of their own. One in Michigan, one in Vermont, one in South Bay, and one just south of Punta Gorda. And they were all fairly successful.
What did it look like on Old 41 and Terry Street at that corner? We know that there was the shell factory. We know there was the dome.
Okay, my earliest memories of Bonita Springs, of course I went to Bonita Springs Elementary School in first and second grade, but even before first and second grade, I remember going to the store, either Benson's or Lawhorn's for my mother, a loaf of bread or a quart of milk, that kind of thing. Just walk down, over the river and to the stores. On the northwest corner of Terry Street was the shell factory. It was a large two-story building, and Dad had added on, a couple of wings, and then there was a big warehouse behind it. On the northeast corner of Terry Street was where our house was, and also we had some little cottages that rented out. And there was an old gas station that was not a gas station. It was just a deserted gas station where this couple lived. And I guess that had to be torn down when he built the dome, because that's exactly where it was. And the original shell factory was actually a small building right to the north of, on the other side of the road, to the north of Terry Street. And I guess that got torn down when he built the shell factory on the other side. And our house was back in there behind the dome. And then later, my sister and I decided we wanted to own horses. We were just in love with horses. And so we went to Iowa and bought 3 horses and brought them back. And Dad had a stable built on Terry Street on the north side. And a gentleman named Mr. Ogilvy, who lived on the west end of Terry Street out in the woods with his large family, he was hired by Dad to take care of the horses and, make sure they were fed and groomed and all that. Another funny story about the horses is back in that day, you had to take them down to a dip and have them, it was like a huge concrete swimming pool, I guess would be the easiest way to describe it. And you take the horses and drive them through there, and they'd come out all wet. And we had to ride them all the way from the shell factory almost to Bonita Beach Road, I think, and then back again to do this dip. And I think it might have been once a month, but it might have been, more like once every 3 or 4 months or 6 months. I'm not sure of that.
Tell us a little bit about how the shell factory started in Bonita Springs.
Mother and Dad had spent a good bit of time, or winters, at Gordon's Pass in Naples, and my dad decided that he wanted to move to Florida permanently and decided on Bonita Springs, and he wanted to build a shell factory. They used to come to Gordon's Pass, which is now Port Royal in Naples, and fish during the winter, because there was no tourist business, of course, in Niagara Falls in the wintertime. So they came down in a little trailer that my grandfather had built and spent the winters fishing in Naples. He was very familiar with the tourist business because in Niagara Falls he had a tourist business which consisted of cars and drivers, that drove people around and gave them the history of Niagara Falls. So he was fairly successful at that. He sold his cars and moved to Bonita, as I said, in 1938 with my sister. She was 2 months old and I was 2 years old. And then when Dad decided he wanted to open a shell business, I guess he just decided on Bonita Springs. The beach was handy, you know, when they'd have tides that bring in lots of shells. Dad would get workers and go down there with bushel baskets and gather up the shells. And of course he bought shells from other places, and then the business grew because he started buying shells from the Philippines and Japan and Africa and everywhere there are shells. The business, once World War II was over, the business was very successful. You know, a lot of people, ex-servicemen, were traveling. Business was very, very good. Dad built up a business, mail order business. He had, Mother had to take packages down to the train almost daily, you know, to be mailed either on the train or to the post office. Well, actually, there wasn't a post office. And when the federal government was going to put in a post office in Bonita, Dad was absolutely sure that it would go down near us because we were the main people that, you know, had lots of mail coming and going. The reason he thought he should certainly get the post office was because he was the biggest employer in Bonita Springs. He actually bought a bus because there weren't enough people in Bonita Springs to work. And so he had a bus that came down every day from Fort Myers and stopped in Estero and picked up a couple of people. And, you know, they came down and worked at the factory, and then the bus took them home in the evenings. But no, Mr. Lawhorn won the post office right next to his store, and Dad was so furious. We were forbidden to ever go in Lawhorn's again. And of course, Richard Lawhorn was, you know, Robert Lawhorn was a friend of mine. And, but we didn't go back to Lawhorn's for anything. But we didn't do most of our shopping in Bonita anyway. Mother went to Fort Myers almost every Friday, picked us up at St. Francis and went to the A&P store and, you know, stocked up on everything we needed. He ended up importing hundreds and hundreds of crates of seashells from all over the world. The Philippines, Japan, Ireland. I mean, there was hardly a country in the world that he didn't import seashells from. But how in the world he made all those connections, I don't know. I know at one time, my husband, Richmond Powell, took my 2 oldest children on a trip around the world, and they visited all these different suppliers. We had semi-trailers, and he delivered shells all along the way from here all the way to California. You know, all kinds of shell shops along the highways, and then when he got to California, everything would be gone, and he'd fill the truck up with abalone shells. And he brought those back. And I think at one time he had at least 2 semis that were running back and forth, in addition to, you know, the mail order business. In addition to the shell factory, Dad took an interest in the baseball team. He sponsored a baseball team and you know, built a baseball diamond, yes, a diamond, right behind the Distant Drums Indian attraction, which was very popular also. He had Indians that he dealt with before he even built the Distant Drums. I mean, he used to go down in the Everglades and buy gar scales from the Indians, and they were, you know, he was on very friendly terms with them. They always gave us wonderful frog's legs when he went down there, in addition to purchasing the gar scales from them. Finally, after the war, Buckingham Airfield closed, and Dad went out there and bought all kinds of things, pool tables, ping pong tables, the Dome restaurant, and had it all brought to Bonita Springs. And, you know, he opened up that as a restaurant, bar, orange juice place, and it was there until, what year did they tear that down?
70s.
70? I do remember there was a move to keep it from being torn down to save it a historical thing. And it seems like somebody interviewed me about that.
So Diane, you went to the Bonita Springs Elementary School for a couple of years, then you went to St. Francis in Fort Myers?
I went to Bonita Springs Elementary School in the 1st grade and 2nd grade. A lovely lady named Mrs. Van Nostren was my teacher. But in the 3rd grade, Mother and Dad decided that my sister and I should go to the Catholic school, St. Francis, which was in Fort Myers. And back then you could ride the school bus. The Catholic children could ride the school bus to Fort Myers. So we did every day. My brother, who was named Bruce, came along in 1941, and he was born in Fort Myers, so he didn't, he was a citizen automatically because he was born here. My mother and dad and I got our citizenship together in the 50s. I think about 56 or 57. The 3 of us went to Tampa and, did the whole test and got sworn in.
What was Bonita Springs like back then?
Oh, Bonita Beach was beautiful, but of course there were no houses. It was totally deserted. We went down and played volleyball almost every Sunday. The whole family would go to Bonita Beach and, picnic and set up a volleyball net, and all my dad's brothers and sisters and cousins and would all go down there and play. One thing I do remember is somebody used to bring Dad a whole galvanized wash tub full of oysters. And we'd sit there and shuck those fresh oysters, and they were just wonderful. I've always loved raw oysters.
So what did you do for fun when you were growing up at Bonita?
Well, we loved to jump in that artesian well at Shangri-La and get the sand rinsed off and the salt. We did that all the time, and I don't think the place was open for business at that time. I mean, we wouldn't have done it probably if it had been a functioning business. Growing up in Bonita was unique. First of all, we played in the middle of US 41. There were not that many cars, and we used to lie down on the road at night and look up at the stars and the moon, and you could hear in the pavement, you could hear cars coming, so we didn't worry about that. We used to ride our bicycles on 41. We used to swim in the ditches north of the factory. I mean, that was a fun thing to do in the summer, when it was so rainy and they were full of water and just rushing. Lots of fun. Used to play in the woods, just roam through the palmettos and never had any worries. It was a great way to grow up. We did a lot of roller skating in the shell factory. It was, it had a concrete floor and all kinds of bins with seashells in them, open bins, and we loved to go over there and roller skate. Of course, we had to do that when the factory was closed. I mean, we didn't do that when the tourists were there, but that was a lot of fun. You don't have TV. I mean, the only thing we listened to on the radio was like the hit parade on Saturday night. White Cliffs of Dover and Glenn Miller and, that kind of thing, I think. And of course, my folks were big dancers, wonderful dancers. Oh, Dad and Mother used to do exhibition dancing, not for money, of course. They used to dance for the Edison Pageant of Light. Tango was their specialty, and they were beautiful dancers, yeah. My dad could make a mannequin look like she knew how to dance, I'll tell you. He was a real, and all of his brothers were the same way. They all were wonderful dancers. As far as clothing goes, there was a lady in Bonita Springs who used to make clothing, and Mother always had my sister and I, all our dresses made by this lady. At least this was, preschool and maybe 1st grade or something. But after that, rather than go to Fort Myers to shop, we went to Miami, over the Tamiami Trail. Mother made it such a fun thing to do. We stayed at a hotel called the Dallas Park. And there was a wonderful, it was like a movie theater, but they had live dancing as part of it. I don't remember the name of it, but it was in downtown Miami near Burdines. And we always, went there, so that was really a treat. But coming back across the Tamiami Trail back then, there weren't many cars either. You could drive almost from Miami to Bonita without running into too many cars. I remember one time we were driving back from Mother getting the groceries at A&P. It was a Friday evening, and it was pouring rain. The ditch was full of water. It was just south of Hanson Street. And something happened. The car spun around, and we ended up in the ditch, and all the groceries were floating around in this ditch. And that, there wasn't much south of Hanson Street then, except Estero was in the middle, that was long before Edison Mall or any of those other things. Mother always warned us not to ever let anybody stop a car and try to get us to get in it. So we were very, very careful, even back then when, of course, you wouldn't have thought of it, but I can remember her saying, don't ever let anybody offer to give you a ride. As far as driving goes, Dad let me drive to Fort Myers on his lap, you know, from about the time I was 8 years old. So by the time I was 10 or 11, he would let me drive the car around Bonita. 12 for sure. And I could take the car and get to Bonita Beach Road and thus to Bonita Beach by staying off the Tamiami Trail pretty much. You know, I probably got down across the river and then went back behind Benson's store and back in those roads and then down to Bonita Beach Road. And I'd pick up my friends along the way and off we'd go. And it was, you know, there was never any problem. I mean, I was a good driver apparently. He trusted me.
So Diane, I understand at the time the Shell factory and the Dome and Distant Drums were the largest employers in Bonita Springs.
I'll tell you about Distant Drums then.
Yeah.
It was a Seminole Indian chickee hut, very large, but they didn't live there, I don't believe. I think they came during the day and they did their beading and they did their sewing, and tourists could go in and see how all those things were made by the real Seminoles. And of course they could buy the things from them. So the Seminoles, you know, had a vested interest in it because they were making money. And I think it worked out very well for them. And I do believe we had maybe an alligator pit in the back, although I'm not sure about that. They had so many alligators down at the Wonder Gardens that, and that's another funny story. I remember David Piper, he went to the Catholic school with us. And one day I was visiting down there with a girlfriend who was spending the night, and David was showing off. He was about our age. And he reached in and petted this panther, and this panther just glommed onto his hand with all its teeth and scared us to death. But fortunately, David was able to get his hand out without any damage. But I can still see that in my mind's eye. It was terrifying. But anyway, so we grew up knowing the Pipers, and of course they were a like tourist business, so you know, I think we complimented each other. Certainly weren't in competition, that's for sure. But then once we moved to St. Francis, to school in St. Francis, everything changed, you know, because all the girlfriends I had were up there and they would come down and spend the night with me in Bonita. And we just kind of lost contact with the Bonita people. But then, of course, we moved to Fort Myers in 1950. My best friend was Jean Strickland, and her brother, I think his name was Jerry, and his parents lived right just south of Distant Drums on the east side of the road. And, her mother's name was Hazel. Dolores Kasner, I mentioned, she lived off of Terry Street to the west. And then there were the Downings. Oh yes, Herb Henning and Jack Hurlmeyer both came to Fort Myers, as I recall, at the same time. I don't know whether they were buddies up north and they just decided to move south. Jack Hurlmeyer and Herb Hennings. And then Herb eventually married Molly True. And that's an old name in Bonita, Donald True. And it was her brother, I think. In fact, Molly's still down there. Herb has since passed away. But the reason I know them so well is they both played baseball for the baseball team, and they were so good.
Do you remember the Baird's camp? Did you ever?
Oh yes, Mrs. Baird, Ruth Baird, I think was her name. I don't remember him at all, but I remember her. She was quite the dapper lady, and that was a popular place. In fact, in that little story that we did on Bonita, everybody said, oh, we weren't allowed to go to Baird's. Well, we were allowed to go to Baird's. I mean, that's where my mother and dad and his brothers, and you know, that's where they'd go to have a drink in the afternoon or in the evening. In 1950, Dad and Mother bought a house on McGregor just south of the Edison home. Really pretty two-story house. We just felt as if we'd died and gone to heaven. And when we moved into that house, it was so nice. And of course, at that point, I was in high school. And the high school was right across, almost across from where we lived. Went to St. Francis, went to Fort Myers High at that point and graduated from from Fort Myers High School. And then unfortunately, the factory burned down in that time frame. 1952, the call came in the middle of the night, and I happened to get up and answer the phone, and I have no idea who it was on the other end of the line. It must have been somebody in Bonita, but they just said, "Get your dad, the shell factory's on fire." And so, Dad and Uncle Ellis jumped in the car and drove down there, and the factory was ablaze, and they passed the fire engine on the way down. There was no fire engine in Bonita Springs, so we had no insurance, and that was a terrible financial blow. It was suspected that it was arson, but it was, there was no way to prove it. There were times when Dad had lots and lots of shells that were rather odorous. When you bring in a whole bunch of seashells, you're going to have a bad odor because they're decaying. What's left of the animal inside is decaying, and it could be rather unpleasant. And there was some talk that possibly somebody did it for that reason, but that's just pure speculation.
Why did your father move it to Fort Myers?
The reason Dad didn't rebuild in Bonita was that the highway department had already decided they were going to bypass the main village of Bonita and put in New 41, and so he thought, well, this is, not going to work. So he rebuilt in North Fort Myers. And they did the same thing there, but fortunately there, he was close enough to the new road that he was able to, to build a highway and put up a big sign, and, it didn't really affect us that much. Dad had to, he didn't have the money to rebuild in North Fort Myers because there was no insurance on the factory that burned down, and so he enlisted 3 different investors. One was a man named James Franklin, who was a state representative of the state of Florida. The other one was a Dr. Harvey Stipe, who was S-T-I-P-E. He was very well known. Of course, we didn't have many doctors in Fort Myers either at that time. And the third one was a man named John Brooks. And they all invested, and Dad was able to rebuild. And then I forget what year it was, probably about 58, Richmond Powell and I bought the factory from Dad. And everything went pretty smoothly, and then we got divorced, as happens. But we had 5 wonderful children.
So besides raising children, I understand you worked at the shell factory and had some other jobs in your life?
I worked very hard at the shell factory. In fact, one time I can remember being in labor and sitting at my typewriter typing like crazy. That was my 4th child in 1960. Before I went to work for the shell factory, I was a legal secretary. I did not get to go to college because my father's business burned to the ground and he couldn't afford it. And I was valedictorian of my class and would definitely have gone to college, a year afterwards, but I decided that I wanted to get married instead, so I did. And so I worked as a legal secretary, and then when Richmond and I bought the shell factory, I quit working as a legal secretary and, went to work out there. But then when we were separated and divorced, I went back to being a legal secretary. I also worked for the county medical examiner. I also worked I had a side job when I was divorced, even though I was getting paid alimony and child support. I had a little extra job typing for the court reporters. So I had quite a background in, medical terms as well as law. And I did move to San Francisco for a year, in which case I worked for the famous lawyer, not for him, but for his firm, Belli. Melvin Belli, remember? I think they used to call him the king of torts or something like that. I worked at his office in San Francisco for a few months.
So tell us about your first husband.
I got married in 1955, and pretty soon after that, my husband at that time, Richmond Powell, went to work for Dad. One of my uncles had decided he was going to go off to South Bay and have his own shell place. That was my Uncle Ellis, who was one of my dad's closest brothers. And so Dad desperately needed somebody, and lo and behold, Richmond Powell took up the job and did a wonderful job. Of course, we were married at that time and were for several years after that. And everything went pretty well until 1960, and Hurricane Donna came along, and the shell factory suffered severe damage from that hurricane.
So then you got married again?
Richmond and I were divorced, and then in about 5 years I married Richard DeBost, who was a lawyer in Fort Myers. He had an exceptionally successful career. He was one of the first condo lawyers in Lee County. Back in the 60s, nobody had even heard of a condo. And he filed the very first condo documents in Lee County and ended up writing, hundreds and hundreds of documents, bylaws and, condominium documents for WCI, which actually owned, this is who we bought this house from. Rick and his wife Carol and my husband Richmond and I were in the same social circle, so we at least knew each other. We actually ended up standing in line to vote for Barry Goldwater for about 2 hours one day, happened to be right next to each other and got to know each other fairly well. And then I guess, what was that, 64 that Goldwater was running? Yeah. We didn't get married until 71. Rick happened to find this property at 40 acres on Hickey Creek. One day somebody had told him about this lovely property that was for sale. A doctor and his wife were getting a divorce, and Rick happened to be, a fairly young lawyer at that time and wasn't real busy, so he jumped in the car and drove out there, and he just fell in love with it. It was, 40 acres with a beautiful creek, lots of oak trees. So he went right back to the office and made an offer and bought it. And so when we got married in 71, we built a house there, which we moved into in 73, and I lived there until August of this year. He passed away in August of 2013. But, when I lived in Alva, if I was on an airplane and somebody said, "Where are you from?" I always said Alva, a little village 15 miles east of downtown Fort Myers, and of course most people had never heard of Alva either. And I lived there by myself, until this past August 2016. But it was pretty lonely, all by myself out there on.
Tell us a little bit about your children.
Okay, Richmond Powell and I got married in 1955, and we're fortunate enough to have 5 children. The oldest is now a Delta captain, flies a 767 across the ocean. We're very proud of her. The second one is Richmond Jr. He's retired from Shell Oil at the ripe age of 57. The third one, Barbara, is married to a lovely man named Tim Cheever. The third one, Christopher, works for FedEx in Memphis in IT, information technology. And the fifth one, John Jr., lives in Houston and works in IT for BP Oil. So they've all been quite successful and have, let's see, I think 7 children between them. And I also have twin great-grandchildren that just turned 3 years old, and they live near Memphis.
So Diane, what do you think about our little town of Bonita Springs today, here in 2017?
Actually, it's sort of fun because, first of all, I voluntarily tell people, that I lived here when I was 2 years old, which is pretty shocking to most of them, that I've, moved back down here. And I tell them about how Bonita was when I lived here as a kid, and now I cannot believe what's happened to it. I mean, nobody could have ever foreseen this happening. my dad and mother, they just would not believe it, I'm sure. And I find it hard to believe. I mean, just driving down this road, Coconut Road, where I live, is 1.5 miles from 41. And the Weeks children in the fish camp, they walk to the school bus every single day. Picked up in the morning and walked back in the evening. I knew those kids. And I mean, now look at Coconut Road and Coconut Point. It's just astounding what's happened to this area. And Bonita Springs is really just the center of the universe down here. And of course, the Everglades Gardens, Wonder Gardens is still there. That's a nice memory. There was an article that said, "Do you know these people?" And it showed a picture of that little building and my aunt and uncle standing. In fact, they were up to their ankles in water. It must have been the summertime. And Kathy Cottrell, that writes for the Naples paper now, she did write for the Banner, and I replied to that, you know, because it said, "Do you know these people?" And of course I did. So I described it all to her. But that little building, Dad must have had it torn down, because when he built the shell factory across the street on the northwest corner, that building was no longer there. When Dad rebuilt the shell factory, just as luck would have it, they decided to cut him off again with a new highway. So, you know, we had to get something built that would get the attention of people driving through, you know, so that they would know we were there. And so he bought that land between the factory and New 41 and, you know, had that sign erected, which was quite spectacular. It's kind of like the golden arches at McDonald's. It kind of reminds me of that. But yeah, they had that huge conch shell fabricated. And as I recall, that thing revolved. And of course, I was still working for the shell factory at that point, or actually my husband and I owned it at that point maybe, or close to it. And you know, they wanted to do a picture with me on that was my convertible, that car under the arch. Tom Cronin owns it now, and he's a high school buddy of mine, and he's done a good job. I understand they've got a zip line, and they've got all kinds of animals and bumper boats, I mean, it's really something.
So here you are back in Bonita Springs. How did that happen?
You know, I was still busy doing all the things that I did, but you know, it was lonely, and you can imagine my surprise when my oldest daughter called one day and said, "Mother, what would you think of us buying a condo or a home together?" And I was pretty surprised because you know, she lived in Minnesota. She was ready to get out of the cold. She'd been working for Northwest and then Delta all these years. So we came down around Mother's Day, I think, and found this place and just decided this was going to be it. Come full circle from being 2 years old playing in the middle of US 41 and putting up with all this traffic now. So it's been an interesting life, for sure. Very blessed and fortunate.
Diane, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your stories. It's been a pleasure meeting you.